All right, now joining us to discuss the impact of the 30% tariffs on business is Dr Stravios Nicolaou, Chair of the South Africa Business Council, rather BRICS Business Council. Good afternoon, Doctor. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Now, the tariffs come into effect after all efforts to negotiate and reset bilateral relations. Let's just start with the most latest. That's President Cyril Ramaphosa holding the telephonic call with US President Donald Trump on the eve of these tariffs coming into effect. Some say that on its own was honestly a futile exercise. We need to now just focus all energies on diversification. What do you make on just that, if you will, last-ditch effort?
Firstly, good afternoon to all the viewers, and thanks very much for having me on your program. I think that all efforts and all attempts to strike a deal on more favorable terms with the United States, who are an exceedingly important trade and investment partner for South Africa, need to be explored, including the phone call that took place between the two presidents yesterday. But if I'm to analyze the way forward, I think there are three things that need to happen here. The first is we need to get a proper handle on the numbers. There have been various scenarios and sort of part number crunching that's taking place on what the impact is going to be both to GDP and to jobs. And I think, quite frankly, no one really has an accurate handle on what the impact on GDP and the job loss numbers are going to be. And I think the risk of not having accuracy there is that you get an exceedingly negative narrative that kind of spirals out of control. So I think the first thing we need to do here is we need to be sober and measured and get some exactness around the numbers. I might concede that perhaps some of the numbers of 100,000 job losses in the automotive sector would appear to be exaggerated at face value, but we do need to get to grips with the right numbers. If you don't know the numbers, then you can't course correct. The second thing is, as I mentioned at the outset, the United States is one of our most important trade and investment partners, and we've got to continue throwing the kitchen sink, I believe, at trying to find a more favorable deal. And that includes the president speaking, the negotiating teams continue speaking to each other. And I think we've seen with President Trump and this 47th administration that changes are possible, and I'm still holding out some hope. Albeit a naive hope that we can still pull back in part from what we got on the 1st of August. And then lastly is the diversification discussion, which is also a very important one. And the only point I do want to make around that is that whether you're in a crisis or not, you should and ought to be diversifying anyway. And I think there are markets that are attractive for us to diversify in. And again, I think we've got to start throwing the kitchen sink at the diversification exercise and project.
And we honestly just want to broaden conversation with you around BRICS and the potential there. But I just want to take you back to your 3 points. You start with a very critical one to say we need to get a handle on the numbers at this point, because you're basically shadowboxing here. You don't know what you're working with. But what we heard is that there's a possibility of shaving off 0.2% of economic growth, which I suppose if we go with that number is quite problematic, given that just alone the growth itself is so low. But we had until April, we had since April to perhaps deal with the numbers, because the potential was always there that the tariffs were coming. Do you think this has been properly handled? That if you had since April to perhaps deal with the outcome, the possibility of an outcome where you wouldn't be able to negotiate favorable rates, should we not have gotten a handle on the figures on what the impact would be so that we limit the anxiety in business? Because today alone, there's a scramble now with some sectors not quite sure even of the nondescript package of interventions that we keep hearing of. Everybody's desperate for information.
Look, I think we've all seen and read the 0.2% shaving off of GDP, which takes us down to 1%. We've heard about the 100,000 or prospective 100,000 automotive sector job losses. I would like to suggest that's where we need more accurate number crunching. So let me rather share with you what are the knowns. To quote a previous Secretary of Defense of the US. You've got known knowns and unknown knowns, right? So what do we know accurately? We know that the United States represents 7.7% of South Africa's exports. So they're not our biggest export market, but they are one of our biggest. And of that 7.7%, 26% of that is attributable to AGOA products and services. And of that 26%, 64% is attributable to automotive exports from South Africa to the United States. So if you just do a back of the cigarette box on those numbers, I don't think you're going to get anywhere close to the 100,000 job losses. And I think we also need to be, I think, sort of moderate around how you view market share loss, because there's an assumption here that you're going to sell no cars to the United States, so that the 25,000 odd vehicles that were sold are going to dry up completely. And that's also an assumption that needs further interrogation. So at base value, the numbers I've given you are the ones that we know factually, and those by extrapolation don't get you to the 100,000 that I was job losses that I was referring to. So what this really points out to all of us is the need to have more accurate data, and only when you have data can you take informed decisions. Now, could we have done this earlier? Most certainly we could have, but I'm not sure what the value is of crying over spilt milk now. I think we need to double down. I think this is really a case again when our country is faced with these challenges. Business and government traditionally have got together and worked together and walked the journey together, and I suggest this is one of those occasions. I think we can sit and nitpick and do all the rest of it. I'm not sure that's going to take us forward. What we need here now is clarity of thought based on empirical data and a very clear strategy of how we're going to diversify, but also try and strike a more favorable deal with the United States.
Again, before we get to the diversification, though, let's talk about what now seems to be a nondescript intervention package. I suppose they're still working on it as to what exactly that support for business could look like. If you're saying that business now and government must pull together and have some sort of a plan to go beyond this moment, what would you think would be the most ideal intervention in this instance if we say the most strategic sectors, being agriculture, the automotive industry, these two? What would be an ideal intervention package for these two sectors?
Okay, so I keep talking in threes today, or 3 points. So I'm going to have another 3 points here on both of these sectors. But I also think diversification doesn't mean that you only focus on these two sectors. Of course, these are, together with textiles, the hardest hit, or going to be the hardest hit. But three things need to happen. The first is we need to improve the ease of doing business both ways. We're still highly bureaucratic, I think, when it comes to economic diplomacy. We need to have skilled people with capacity and resource to execute on diversification. And part of that resource and capacity means that people are equipped to improve the ease of doing business. We're still far too bureaucratic. We've seen this, we've lost share to other African countries, and that's inexcusable for me. So we do need to improve on that. The second thing is that we should be agnostic, politically agnostic, I would like to say, as to where we trade and invest. What do I mean by this? This means that the trade patterns have to be carefully analyzed between all the geographies that we have an interest in. And as a country, we have an interest in the West, the East, and the South. The emerging South is very important for us. But we also need to, again, be evidential in how we approach it. So by way of example, we run significant trade deficits with certain countries. China is an example. And there's no problem running trade deficits. The problem here is that we're exporting raw materials and importing finished value-added goods from elsewhere, including China and other parts of the world. So we ought to be improving our implementation of our own policies that enable industrialization so that we can even out these trade patterns. So industrialization is at the core and heart of us diversifying. And then third and lastly, we do need to look at a revised, and I know DTIC are looking at this, we do need to look at a revised package of how you incentivize certain sectors. Traditionally, we've had a one-size-fits-all type of suite of investments, of investment incentives. I think these need to be tailored, customized, and I think precision is a good word here to be used so that they are fit for purpose for specific sectors and specific products, goods and services.
Doctor, thank you very much for your insights this afternoon. That's Dr. Stravios Nicolaou. He is, of course, chair of the BRICS Business Council, speaking to us there.